Yeah.
Good morning.
Morning. I think we're both tired.
I think we're both tired. I have a hell of a week. So here's something that you may or may not know.
Tell me.
I'm heading. So after I'm doing this recording project up until Wednesday.
Yeah.
And then on Thursday I get in the car. I drive out to Baltimore for Lord Baltimore's challenge because I'm going to be hawking some stuff for Nicole at HemaWare.
Nice.
And so, but I'll also get to see Lisa, and I'm hoping to see Kenny. So Kenny was one of my. Kenny's like, he's basically like one of everybody's favorite people.
Kenny fan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just an unbelievably amazing dude. And he won't be in town because he took his fam out to the beach. So he's like at a beach. I don't know if he's at like a beach resort or something, but he's coming in on Friday, and we're gonna get some dinner or something. So he's gonna come in for the night or whatever. I don't know exactly.
That's awesome.
But I'm really excited to see him because his whole life got thrown into chaos. Talk about being thrown headfirst into an environment that you don't know how to like negotiate so that you can anticipate behavior, right? Like
legit.
He has lived a very consistent life for even as chaotic as the rest of us would have maybe understood that life to be. I think that he had his arms wrapped around it, and he knew how to function in it. And the type of chaos that he took on, now being married with a kid, is pretty radically different than anything that he's ever experienced before. And so I can only imagine. But I bet you I'm really excited to see him because it's been like 2+ years. I mean, certainly since before the pandemic, but like even before that, it's been several years since I've seen him, and he's he hasn't been doing as much historical fencing lately because of his life. So it'll be nice to see, and then Lisa and all the folks in Baltimore. And so I'm looking forward to that. But it's like I got so much on my plate. I got to do this recording project, and then I got to go do that. What about you? Yeah. You got what's your schedule like these days?
I don't even know. Like every week is new and different and So this week I have some climbing planned, some more indoor climbing and some horse lessons. So that'll be fun. And me and one of the coaches out at the barn, I knew them when they used to come out here and do swords with me when I had like group classes, right? And then we got to talking and found out we both went out to the same barn. Anyways, they're a coach out there now, right? And like they specialize in donkeys and mules, and they're amazing. So now that they're coaching, like one of the things that they had run into was ways to keep smaller children engaged with the horse stuff while they still aren't very good, because, children 8, 9, 10, they kind of flake off real easy. So like having a couple foam swords out there really engages a kid on horseback or many kids on horseback. And so we've been throwing around the idea of starting a little club out there for historical equestrian swordsman stuff. So we'll see.
That sounds amazing. And that is such a fascinating question, how to engage kids because they are flakes.
Yeah. I mean, right? We all are, but
right. No, for sure. And I've run into various methods or various approaches to addressing or dealing with these questions. I mean, we don't know how to teach each other or learn as adults. So like, I'm not surprised that we don't know how to teach kids or how to engage kids. But like,
yeah. I read an article. I'll find it, put it in the show notes yesterday. I think yesterday. That was kind of addressing this question and was saying, like, we need to like at university stop pretending that lecture is the way people learn, because lecture is literally not how anyone learns.
yeah.
And
No.
so it was putting forth a bunch of evidence that, and it was talking about STEM topics in particular, but that giving people hands-on problem solving time in class was way more useful than talking to them about how to problem solve. So
right, especially like you might think that that maybe lecture had a function in a pre like in a time where content wasn't like immediately accessible all the time. Like, so like if you didn't really have access to the exact books that you need or whatever, like maybe going to class was an opportunity to just sit and download content. So like maybe it was the equivalent to reading a book for us, right? Or doing quick research on our right devices. But certainly in an era where we don't need to do that at all. Like we can just read a book or like immediately have a book in our hand, or just listen to it. Like we don't even need to read the thing. We can just sit back and listen to it. And so I wonder if like what we're getting from university is a vestige of a period of time where information wasn't. I don't know. I'm totally riffing or spitballing, right? I don't. But it certainly doesn't. It's not like we seem to know that the best way to learn information or learn applied information is to like apply it in a very small context several times until you gain a competency, and then you gradually build off that, right? Like that's been the whole premise of our podcast. That's been like, I have all of my experience, all my kids, like it just seems to, but that's certainly not the way that I would say about half, at least. I know I've recently been in higher education. So within the last 10 years, we'll say, it was about half and half. So half the teachers just sat dribbling content on us. And then the other half actually tried to involve us in some way using applied skills and stuff like that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure. No, I'm with you. I think so. And then of course, adding the element of play.
Right. Exactly.
But, we have to, well, I might be throwing out my opinions here, but it seems to me that a large part of the purpose of school is to accustom children to the idea of butts and seats. So,
Yeah, I don't think that's unreasonable, or like that has immediately it has these conspiracy theorist sort of vibes, right?
Oh, I mean, that's not what I'm suggesting.
No,
but...
I know. Well, I hope not, because I think that what you're saying is pretty like it's just structural, right? Like, there are people. It's not unreasonable to say like there's a school board and they're sitting around trying to figure out how they're going to do this, and someone's like, well, we need to make sure that they get, like that's a reasonable thing to expect to happen, right? It's like when, for instance, there's an argument that school is often used as a sort of a holding pen for keeping kids out of the workforce, because they'll depress wages if they go into the workforce at 14 years old and don't care about what they're getting paid because they're living with their parents or whatever. And like, okay, yeah, that sounds like pretty ridiculous, except that you could totally see people saying that, like, that's what like on a school board, like,
Right.
people are making those arguments. Those are real arguments that are being made. And so like, I think you're right. I think that at the end of the day, the way that our school system is designed is meant to serve more people than the children, right? It's meant to serve society,
Yes.
which really means a bunch of lobbying interests, right? Like that's the way our society works, and formally and politically in the U.S. today, right?
Unfortunately, yeah, yeah. I mean, forever ago, I read this wonderful book with a terrible name. It's called Teen 2.0. Like, worst name
terrible
ever.
name.
Terrible name. But it is a book I found deeply challenging. That by the end of it, to your point, by the end of reading this book, I was like, maybe I should reconsider my stance on like child labor laws.
Oh man, yeah, I've
Right?
definitely heard some evidence that was like shocking, like like that the implications of which are like this,
Yeah.
like kids learn in these environments, right?
Right. And so you want to say, well, if I wanted my kid to excel at his father's trade, right, which is cybersecurity, like there is no reason Brian couldn't right now start like doing crazy hacker red hat shit at home. And like, hey buddy, here's your key to the dark web. Let's go figure out how bad you can mess it up. You know what I mean? Like, there's really no reason. And other than we say you shouldn't be engaging in any of these things until you've got a couple years of college under you. So you're 20 now, 21.
Right. And the argument is, I think the argument is valid, right? So like,
yeah,
you need a well-rounded education. You need to take your time, the time that you have, and devote it to making sure you're developing this sort of multi-faceted, multi-dimensional educated self, right? So that
so that you what though?
Right.
Because like I know that's the ideal, and believe me, like my little liberal heart is like singing in joy when you say these words, but then when I like dig into it for a half second, I say nobody I know really feels like that's what they got,
right?
Especially out of high school.
Right.
Nobody got a well-rounded education out of high school.
We say so that they. I think the so that they is sort of there's an implication that if you get this sort of education that's very carefully curated by these sort of kind of technocrats, essentially, right?
Yeah.
That you will be better equipped to make more. You'll be better equipped to apply more tasteful discernment, and right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that is a beautiful way to put it. Because what strikes me is that college education, listen, I'm pro college. My kids are going, whatever, right? But that being said, is very similar to having a manicured lawn.
Right. Yeah, because that tasteful discernment is, that's a pretty subjective. That's a pretty deliberately subjective term, right?
Right.
And almost an aesthetic term, right?
It's a rich people term. Who talks about taste but rich people?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know.
Yeah. So I mean, listen.
I set the mood. Sorry, y'all.
If and when we get to our topic du jour, talk about disobey, right? So we're gonna begin with talking about the preeminent anarchist of the HEMA world.
Let's jump into it. Do it.
Well, no, because I want to keep talking about this. So like, this is so good.
Okay.
We literally said before we started this show today that we were not going to get political ever in our podcast. No, but listen, so here's what we're saying. We're saying that regardless of what you think about whether, I think we all agree, I think everybody agrees that we should do whatever we can as a society to make sure that our kids, I guess not everyone, but I think the vast majority of people in the US will say under our national umbrella, believe that society should do everything that it can to make sure that kids are best prepared for life when they enter into it. And
correct.
So all we're suggesting is that we have a model right now, and there are models that we haven't really explored, and they're interesting.
Right. Well, and I think so. I mean, back to like why lecture. It strikes me that probably I think your insight into books, right, is accurate. But when I think back to, so now I'm picturing doctors in a salon in 1870 with a cadaver in front of them, right? Like that's when I think back to the history of that style of education, right? That's what it looked like. And before then, it was what? One rich guy with cool ideas sitting around telling other rich guys what he thinks are the right ideas. Because this is all going back to a worship of classical antiquity, and everyone trying to set themselves up as the next Socrates or whomever, right?
In the Lyceum, right? Like that's what we're trying to emulate.
Right. Because that was the one right way, right? Anyone educated knew that was the way it was done, right? So it strikes me that like so many things I've observed in my personal life, momentum is a bitch, and it's really hard to change things. Yeah.
There's like there's institutional inertia, right? That's pushing things forward like that, and it's not to say that like what we have like obvious. So it's like categorically true that what we do can be done better, right? Like that's just sort of the nature of our humanity, right? So so we can preserve the institution and preserve the romance of the institution, and then also make it more effectual. So like I mentioned this professor before, one of my economics professors, not the one who had the ideas that I was most compelled by. In fact, I had a professor whose ideas compelled me like to no end. Like I was just obsessed with the things that he said and the things that he believed and the knowledge that he had. But when it came to learning economics, right? It was this professor who would come in and he gave us handouts, and we would just do the handout, and it would be it would feel like it was 5 minutes worth of work, right? Like the handout was 5 minutes worth of work. And he would have you do, he would have you do the problem several times, right? So there would be like everything he had you do on the paper, every type of problem or every step. So, and that was really the key, because he would show you he would break the whole concept down into these steps, and he would have you repeat the steps 5 to 10 times. Every single one of these handouts, he would do it the same way, right? So you'd come in, he'd give you a handout, say, okay, we're going to do this, and maybe we're looking at the marginal, the marginal product of labor, right? And so he's like, he's like looking at, how, he'd have a list of numbers, which is the whatever the marginal product value, or he would just like have you go through and apply, like do the equation 10 times, and then he'd move on to the next step, and then he'd have you do the equation 10 times, and it was like an addition. It was like an addition equation, right? Like it was like you would do this addition equation 10 times, and then you do this or multiplication equation, and then it was the simplest, easiest way of learning a concept. And then at the end of it, you had done each step so many times that you knew what the step was. You walked out with a clear sense of what all the steps were, and you walked out with a clear sense of what all of the formulas were, what what that part of the equation was, or whatever. And then like you really left the thing knowing what the hell was going on. And that was radically different than every other experience that I had in college. It was just like, and I learned so much more about economics that way. And it's really just because we learn by applying, we learn by repetition, right? And we also learn by observation, right? And so maybe, learning by observing the professor do the thing, right? As opposed to just like, data dumping and then trying to retain all that information that's completely contextless and that we haven't ever applied and whatever, right? So like,
I mean, I think about all the time, to circle it around to fencing, like I'll start a class and then just be like, shut the fuck up, shut up. Why are you trying to talk to them? It's not helping anyone. You think you're helping. Think you're helping, but you're not, right? And it's been a long time since, pre-pandemic, since I was leading regular group classes here, but I had reached a point I was pretty happy with, which I think is related to what you're saying, where for warm up, maybe we would grab a spear, and I wouldn't say these words, but I would, I would demo a fucking crumphow with a spear, right? So, you start in what, you start in the third guard, but which is basically Shronkut, right? And pop your spear up, get a bind, do a thrust, couch drive, whatever. And like, so we're doing that for the warm up, and then we grab swords, and then we crumphow, and then we finish that play. And like, so my idea always was, by the time we got to the end, they'd realized they'd been doing the same action all class, and that nothing was new or new or surprising. Like everything logically, body motion built on itself, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, oh, I'm crumphowing with this. Oh, I'm fucking catching a thing with my dagger. Oh, I'm crumphowing with my sword. Oh, I'm, doing a wrestling entry for a rear throw. Like, fuck, it's all the same thing, And so I would try to do that because that is something that I could set up and replicate for a group.
Right. Yeah. So my program has kind of been longer term, right? So I will do a lot of talking, but it'll be every class we say the same thing over and over again, right? So so like every single class we begin with just a body movement warm up. So we're just like doing cuts. Maybe we're doing cuts, right? So maybe we're going from a low guard on the left hand side. So I'm talking about Meyer rapier right now. So low guard on the left hand side and up into ox. So just doing this, right? So, and what are we? And so then, you know, and then from here we're thrusting,
Right.
and then cutting, right? So low guard, thrust, cut, right? And so then the question is like, okay, so what is happening here? We're beginning, and what kind of posture is this? So we would call this a weak posture because we're oriented towards the ground, right? So our sword is pointed towards the ground. It's weak to our opponent. And so then as they cut in the vor, we work in the knock to clear their sword. So what distance do we have to be in? We have to be in the Sufechten, because if we're in the Krieg and we're in this posture, then we're going to get stabbed in the face before we are able to get our parry off. So we know that we have to be in the Sufechten in this posture, and we're inviting our opponent to cut into us, in which case we're going to clear the center in a strong way. So we're going to strengthen, right? And then as we strengthen, if our opponent, if we effectively strengthen, our opponent doesn't work indes, then we're going to work in the vor. Now, if our opponent hasn't worked indes, then now we're strong, they're weak, and so we're going to work in the vor by extending our action to a thrust. If they parry indes, then we'll cut indes, right? So like, so what we've done in that instance, right, is reiterated concepts of the Sufechten in the Krieg. We've reiterated provokers, right? So we're provoking in a weak way. We've reiterated strong and weak. We've reiterated vor and knock and indes, and basically all of those concepts, and saying them over. And then the other thing too is that we'll stop, you know, so I will say, so we're here and we're going to do this, and then we're doing this. And so like, when do I have to do this action, right? So as I thrust, when do I cut, right? And the answer is indes, right? And so give the students an opportunity to say those words. And I find that, and that's literally just like a warm-up that we decided to do. So the warm-up was just this action, right? Boom, 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 right? That was it. Boom, boom, boom. Maybe we just go up and then we cut down, right? So maybe, and literally the warm-up hasn't really changed, but what's changed is tactical. So I start in a low guard, I clear the center, but my opponent does work indes, right? So cuts around as I do this, and then I cut to clear the new action, right? So it's not, in this case, I'm not actually entering in the vor.
Yeah.
They're provoking, I'm taking indes, they're chasing, right? So now they're knock rise in indes, and I have to take indes a second time. And and so just repeating this framework over and over and over again, regardless of that. And I chose that example because that's what we did last week, right? Like it could be, but it could be anything. It could be anything, and it is often anything, because it'll often start with just the warm-up, or it might start with an assessment during like free play in the beginning of class. And the important thing is that it is everything, right? And so like every single time that the students show up, they get the same reinforcement of all of those concepts over and over and over again. And all they have to do is just think about how they're applying those concepts in any given moment. And then when they get into an exchange, they have all of those super accessible all the time, right? Like they know, like they're standing in the Krieg and someone thrusts them in the face and they're too late to parry. And it's like, oh, I was weak in the Krieg. I shouldn't have done that. That was stupid, because my opponent is faster than me. Definitively, like definitionally, my opponent is faster than me. Right. So I should have been in this posture at a farther distance, that where my opponent would have been slower to complete his action before I was able to counter it. So sorry.
Right. No. I'm with you. Yeah. And likewise, eventually, you do need to give words, because otherwise nobody knows what's happening.
Right. Well, yeah, we use the words to make these. Yeah. I think about this a lot too, right? Like
Right.
the function of concepts, right? So concepts are not just like, they help us make systems, they help us categorize, they help us frame
And the whole reason we need to frame is so that we can story tell to ourselves and to each other about what just happened.
yeah, they help us storytell. Yeah.
Yes. Right? Because you don't need to understand like the framework you just set up of being weak in the Krieg is shit because it makes you slow, right? And I know there's more to it than that, but I'm just because we don't
That's
need to.
right. That's fine, right? That's a thing that a student of mine might hear, right?
Right.
And like, and then would also be able to parse out if you press them on it, right?
Right. Exactly. So like you don't need that framework to understand that you just got wrecked when you took that position too close.
Right.
Pretty much anybody is going to understand, oh, I took this position and I got wrecked. I'm never going to take this position that close ever again. But they might not be able to more broadly apply that idea to other different weak positions.
Right.
And so by giving them that framework, that allows them to self-storytell about
Right.
things you never taught them.
Exactly. So now it might not be that their sword was down by their left-hand side. Now it might be their sword was out in front of them. They just didn't know how to hold it. Right. Or or their sword was strong and then they weakened, like by trying to pull back to offend in a different way, and then they got knock rising, right? So like all of it is the same concept, and having that accessible there, readily accessible, to be able to immediately take the phenomena that the fencer experienced and immediately arrange it in a way that makes coherent sense. Like, okay, I know what happened.
Yes.
I wasn't paying attention.
Right. And I think, I mean, this is interesting because this is something that I think many modern fencers miss when they read the books, because the books appear to set up if-then statements that people believe should be followed. Like there's one right way to follow that if-then statement, and that's what we should be aiming for. Whereas I strongly believe, and I think many people believe and understand, that the if-then statements are just there to help you figure out what the broad concept is. That's its only purpose. Its purpose isn't, this is what you have to do to fence. That's foolish, because there's infinite permutations of fencing.
Right. And so I would say that philosophically, you could ground your argument philosophically very, very easily.
Oh, cool.
Right.
All right.
Well, no, I mean, I'm just saying, like, so like we know that the art is an expression of a person's, like the art is always personal, right? Like it has to be, right? And so if we're saying like, this is a thing that you do in this situation, like whether or not it's the right thing is not a question of art. It can't be, right? Right. So like all it is an expression of art.
Yeah.
Right. All that we can get from the text is an expression of art. Right. Now if it, and we're making that distinction again, right? So if it were science, then we could just say, okay, this is the science, right? But we know that that's not what we're getting from the text, right? And then the question of what informs those decisions, right? So art being an application of human creativity and imagination, art being choices, art being choices that somebody makes.
Yeah.
Right. And so that would be the way that I would sort of approach that question philosophically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, and then like, and so if art is, go ahead.
Well, and I mean, thinking about, how emotions are made again, like her brilliant, I think it's a freaking brilliant example of understanding concepts and how weird they really are is she gives the example of, if I say to you, James, let's go get some fish. Are we going to a restaurant or are we going to a pet store?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah. And we can use fish to mean both of those things. And neither of us are even remotely fazed by how
we know,
absurd that is.
right?
Right?
We know exactly what you mean in that context, right? Like we know, and maybe
Hopefully.
it's, well, maybe it's the words that you chose to use. Maybe it's the context in which you chose to use them.
The previous conversation up to that moment, right?
Or
And,
just like
and
whether or not culturally, if we actually were going to go get you some fish to have in your house and that you would feed over the course of some years or whatever, months probably. I don't know how long do fish live. I don't know anything about fish.
I had a plecostomus that was 13 years old when my heater in my tank flipped out and killed him.
I guess I'm just thinking about like goldfish. Don't goldfish die after a couple months?
No, only because we mistreat them. They also can live like 50 years, dude. It's just because we're awful.
But so anyways, like maybe there's an expectation that if that's what you meant, you're going to say something else before that, right? Like you're not just going to say that.
Right. And this, I mean, it's just fencing, right? Like people, sometimes people get freaked out by like, they're used to only, like, maybe they're from a Leichenauer club and they've only seen a certain presentation of guards, and then a Fiore stands in front of them and they're like, what the fuck is happening? And like the answer is, what the fuck do you think it looks like? Right? Broaden your concept of famtag to include the 17 posted idanas or however many there are, right? Because who actually cares? Like what's going to happen from that position? What is threatened from that position? So if you can't make your concept of famtag include anything that's going to drop on you from above, your famtag needs to be reassessed. You have,
or maybe it doesn't need to be reassessed, but it's certainly less. There's less utility in understanding it, right? Like, if we're really only limited to, four postures that look, that has
a style.
And like very, very small tolerance, right? So like a tiny little window or a tiny little sliver of what is possible is sort of how we define this thing. Well, then having four of them is probably terrible, right? Like,
yeah.
So it doesn't make a lot of sense that it would be that, right?
It doesn't, and yet, right. Again, like this, you framed it as a scientific idea, but which is fine. But this idea of, I would say a digital idea. A digital idea is of, either famtag is on or it's off, right? And I just don't think so. I think it's a fuzzy dial that goes all sorts of ways, and that's more useful not only for your ability to assess the fencer in front of you, but for your own ability to assess what you're doing.
Mhm. Yeah. I think the problem, and to use your analogy, I think the problem with looking at it as on or off is that once you get to the end of, so like you've got on or off for 4 different categories, right? And it's like it's possible for everything to be off, right?
Right.
And so
Yeah.
like, what do you do then? So that's not a good system, right? So
No. Right.
um,
Right. And yeah, it's limiting in a lot of ways, I think.
right.
I mean,
What
I
about
understand the drive to like optimize. Lord knows I'm always playing with
Mhm,
that for sure.
mhm,
Uh, but I think it needs a push and pull. It needs a drive to optimize and a drive for slop because it's
mm,
fencing.
yeah. Yeah. Okay, so uh we'll have to come back to, because I did, the reason that we didn't jump right into our discussion of the history of historical fencing and HEMO is because we were having a really awesome conversation about how we feel about the way we educate
Yeah.
youths in our country. But we've let that ship has sailed, so we have to do that another time. We'll have to talk about
All right.
so this weekend, or before this weekend, so like Thursday, I went up to Madison to visit with Michael Chittister and Chris Van Sambrock, who were Michael and Kendra had come from Boston to um, to visit with Chris, and then head down to the Meyer Symposium, which happened this weekend, which I wasn't able to attend. This has been the first international Meyer Symposium that I haven't attended since like 2016, and it was a real
Wow.
disappointment that I wasn't. Yeah, because
Yeah.
of this recording project. So
Right.
I got called in for this, and there was no way out. Which is fine. I needed to do it, and I missed the symposium and sad, but it is what it is. But I wasn't gonna not catch those guys.
Right.
So we had a nice day. We went and visited a book bindery. So Michael Chittister is like the president and operator. I don't know what his role in the company the HEMA bookshelf. But he's sort of the head honcho, proprietor, chief operator, owner. I don't know.
Head dude.
Head honcho is
Yes.
and the bindery that he uses is in Madison. So
okay, that's cool.
It was super cool. We got to go visit and see all of the inner workings of a 21st century bindery, which functions as a 20th century bindery.
Right.
Like really, it functions as a 19th century bindery in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Right. But it was amazing. It was so neat. And it was great to see those guys, especially because I haven't seen Michael and Kendra for 3+, like 3.5, 4 years probably. I mean, it's been so long. And so it was really neat. But the Meyer Symposium is hosted by the Meyer Freifester Guild, and the Meyer Freifester Guild has a really interesting place in historical fencing history.
Yeah.
Because it was started. So the Meyer Freifester Guild was the people behind it were the people behind the first Arma schism. So I don't know how familiar you are with that story.
A little bit.
So I'm going to give you my sort of backfilled version of. I don't want to speak with any authority, but
sure.
The way that I understood it was that Kevin Maurer started doing Meyer work, very explicitly Meyer work. He was very interested in translating the texts and passing them out to everyone who was interested. And he just had a sort of very he had an attitude of like, this should be for everybody and everyone should get a hold of this,
Right.
because this is like God's text. He really felt and feels to this day very strongly about Meyer's fencing.
Yeah.
And that didn't go over well in the way that Arma was organized, right? And so that sort of started a kerfuffle, and Kevin ended up. I think Kevin got the boot. I think he was the first one who got the boot, and then Mike Cartier, who had been Arma, and so Mike Cartier was a guild captain for basically from 2009 until he died recently. But he was like, well, no, fuck this. Like,
right.
we're not fucking doing that. Like, I'm out of here. Right. And he was like, he was an anarchist. But by anarchist, I mean, he had a giant anarchist tattooed all over his chest, like in like this giant Superman A tattooed to his chest. And he was like an OG, like punk, revolutionary in the streets anarchist. And so he wasn't a good fit anyway. He was just really interested in fucking fighting people with swords. And so
right because Arma was and probably still is a very hierarchical organization.
Right. But it was also exactly the type of intensity and carelessness and recklessness that Mike Cartier, anarchist Mike, thrived on.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And so it was the place for him until the authoritarianism started being flexed, and then he was like, no, man, this is we're done, man. We're so he left, and then it was after that, I think, and this is, you'd have to talk to Jake about to get the rest of the story, but like that was what kicked the whole thing off. It was Kevin got the boot, anarchist Mike was like, fuck this, and then that set off a chain of events that led to a number of other clubs in 2009 to but
yeah. And maybe we can find somewhere Jake tells that whole story on a different HEMA chat show. So I'll try to find that link and put it up for anybody that wants to hear it from Jake.
Yeah. So, but in any case, so Mike started the Freifester Guild, and he and Kevin, and then Chris Van Sembrock, and a few other sort of devotees of Meyer coalesced, and they formed this guild. And it was initially a member of the Human Alliance, but really it was just sort of, it's a really interesting guild. I think for this, one of the best people one of the best resources to learn about is what Michael Chittister posted after his passing, which was a whole sort of biography. Yes. It was a whole biography of Mike and how he viewed historical fencing, and how he viewed his role and the role of the guild. And for him, like, if you liked Meyer, you were in the guild. Like there was no hierarchy. It was just fraternity. That was the kind of anarchist that Mike was. Mike and I bonded over anarchism, although I took a more like ivory tower academic approach to anarchy than he did. But one thing about anarchism that's super interesting to me, and the variety of anarchism that Mike was engaged with, is the fraternity, right? So like the story of Mike's anarchism was like brother, and for him, the bonds of fraternity were forged over love of Meyer, right? And so he just wanted to love Meyer and fence, and and so he died a few years ago, and it was a big blow because he was pretty young. He was in his 50s.
Yeah. Right.
But it really like shook a lot of those of us who knew him and those of us who were around at the time, because of how influential just some pithy decisions that he made back in 2009 ended up being, right? Because that changed the whole community.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I wanted to talk to you because, I tried to join ARMA in 2009. And I think he just like put my application in a drawer, and then that was the
Sounds right.
And then like and then a few months later the HEMA Alliance formed, or would eventually form. And so like then I was like, okay, this is fine, I'll just do this. But you've been around forever. You've been around through all of that, right? So
I'm quite vintage. Yes.
And so I wanted you to talk about what it was like, how those events sort of happened for you. So where you were before that, and how you envisioned the community before that, and then when things changed, how they changed for you.
Yeah, it's funny because I didn't give no shits. It was not momentous to me whatsoever, because the community was ARMA and everyone else, and I was everyone else. So I didn't give two shits about what was happening in ARMA, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I kind of vaguely kept track, but I wasn't, at one point, like, of course, this is back in forum days, right? Because 2009 Facebook was just kind of opening to the world, right? So we would all meet on many of us on Sword Forum International was the one at that moment. But there were ARMA forums and Scala forums, Scala whatever, UK, right? UK forums.
the Fiore, right? The Fiore de Liberi forum.
Yeah, right. And I wasn't doing ARMA or Fiore, so I didn't bother to sign up for those forums. And so I missed a lot of that drama. I would hear things around because, of course, it bled out. And there were certainly people who were cheering the dissolution with ARMA, because many people had bad experiences with ARMA, and so I heard some stuff, but like, to be honest, it didn't even remotely enter my consciousness as a thing to care about. Oh, those guys over there are doing a thing. Okay, do your thing. Right?
Did it ever, looking back, do you think you ever had a shift in perspective where you see it or saw it as more momentous than it was for you at the time? Or like, how do you, I guess I would say, like, certainly it seemed, and it's just the way that the sword community grew after, right? So like, I think the reason that we look back at it now and say that was a milestone is because things blew up after that, right? But then the question is, well, would they have blown up anyway? Like Facebook, really, it could be that Facebook was the real thing, or just, but before Facebook, it was the HEMA forums and the HEMA Alliance forum. The HEMA Alliance forum definitely felt like it made things more accessible to me, right? I don't know. So I guess, like, what's your perspective on it now? How do you view the history of HEMA and that event?
Yeah, well, so the dissolution of ARMA was, I mean, you could say the creation of the HEMA Alliance, which is accurate, but more specifically was the creation of tournament culture. Because those that left ARMA left to create tournaments. Mm-hmm. I mean,
yeah, no, I mean, well, so right, not Mike. They didn't,
but they did. you know.
Well, no, you're right.
Right.
You're right. Because it was so Mike and Kevin did not leave to create tournaments, although
Correct.
I think the first American historical fencing tournament, I believe, was hosted by Mike in Tallahassee. I think was it Tallahassee
Right.
or like
I don't know.
it was in Florida, I think. And they used nylon longswords, and like elbow pads and lacrosse gloves and t-shirts.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, right. But yeah, so, but you're right.
Well, and the thing is that before then, what was being promoted was the idea of what did we even call them? Prize fights, basically, right? That there wasn't an open tournament.
Martial challenges.
That is what we called it. But long story short, it was if you got to prove your chops somehow, and you got to do it publicly. So you and somebody else are going to agree to publicly fight for everyone else to get to watch, right? And so that was that was happening. And of course, I recall, since we're talking about Irma, I recall that maybe a big impetus for starting that was one of the founders of Arma, because of course that's a whole shit show as well, because it wasn't even Arma, it was Haka. Anyways, he was talking shit on the forums about people not putting up, and so he got specifically called out to show up to one of these things. People offered to pay his way. People offered to put money down. Shockingly, he never showed. Right. Who knew it would be like that, right? But it really did start, or at least there was an element of dojo storming, right? It's just the same stupid bullshit that's gone on in martial arts since forever. But anyways, and then Arma blew up, and many of the, maybe not all, but many of the people who left Arma were pumped about tournaments and growing the community through the use of tournaments.
Right.
And they had great success.
They did, yeah. And so maybe that's the amount. I think, for me at the time, it was just the availability of public events. So if it hadn't been tournaments, right? If just everywhere there was a tournament, it was a historical fencing event, right? Then I would have been just as excited, right? I would have been just as I would have been just as involved as much as I could have been at any given time. But for various reasons, the events were tournaments, and maybe that's just because people are more motivated to host tournaments, or maybe it's because I think there's probably true that there was a general lack of confidence in what people were teaching, so people didn't really. I think that people didn't want to put their expression of sort of historical fencing as the headliner, right, as the top of the card of an event, like come listen and learn from what this person has to say about historical fencing. I think that it's easier to have an event that says come fence in this formally organized tournament, and then also you get to listen to this person who's not really important but has some interesting things to say about fencing, right? And I think that it was probably easier for people to feel more comfortable at that time to involve themselves that way, right? I mean, I'm sure that some people felt like what they had to offer was really, really high quality, but I think in general at that time people were very insecure about like what they well, I mean, because that was, so the Arma people had a curriculum, right? I think, and I don't even know what the ARMA curriculum was because it was it was literally secret. But like everybody else was just kind of trying to figure stuff out, and they came up with some things or whatever. Go ahead.
I mean, I wouldn't say everyone else. I think that's very broad.
No, right. That's true.
There are a lot of schools that had curriculums at the same time, most of which are still around, one of which I'm a member of, right? So I wouldn't say that at all. Nor do I think there was a lack of confidence, because Jesus Christ, if martial artists have anything, it's a willingness to stand up and say they know what the fuck they're talking about. So I also don't know that I would buy that as the issue.
Fair. I mean, maybe I'm just projecting a little bit.
I think you are. Right? Because I think about, like, there was an event in upstate New York in 2008, 9. Another ex-ARMA member who was probably leaving at the same schism that I paid no attention to, hosted it on his 80 acres or whatever he had. And so we all went up and camped and fenced, and we brought over people from Germany, and there were furious, and like it was very collegiate, and there was all kinds of stuff getting taught, all kinds of pickup fencing, like everyone would recognize this event as a completely modern HEMA event, but it wasn't circled around a tournament. It was just circled around fraternity. Like, we all want to go and do this thing. And everybody offered some shit that they were, I taught some wrestling and some longsword. I was actively nursing a child while I did that, right? Like, it was very collegiate and chill, So, like, yeah, I don't know. Here's what I think. I think that martial arts sound intimidating and sports sound accessible.
Yeah. Right. And I mean, we're circling back to this, right? It's not just accessible. I mean, yeah. So it's like accessible writ large, right? Culturally accessible. We can share it with our family and share it with our friends and say, yeah, this is what I do. And you're not going to be weirded out when you see it. You're going to be like, oh, this is pretty cool. Yeah. So,
right. Yeah. So it got circled around. It got circled around that, and it drew a lot of people in. I do think you're right. Because frankly, if you're going to play with swords, you got to find a way to explain it to your dad. Go back and watch our thing from Bell Hooks, right? And so,
did I just lose you?
Sword thing, because it's a sport. Oh, sorry. I know it's my internet.
No, but you're back.
Are we back? Okay. But saying to your dad, hey, I'm doing this sport that happens to involve swords, is easier than I'm going down to the park with a bunch of anarchists to fuck around with swords.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it's all of this to say, missing the symposium was kind of a disappointment, because it was, we haven't seen each other in forever, and it was an opportunity to sort of reflect on the life and influence and importance of this sort of figure in historical fencing, at least for us, for those of us who knew him, and for those of us who kind of knew about his role and just what he meant to us, like it was so yes, a tournament culture developed out of what became the schism, right? But really before that, it was Kevin's Kevin and Mike's sort of attitude of, this is for everybody who wants it, right? It shouldn't be kept from people. It shouldn't be sort of authoritatively administered. And Mike's sort of anarchist attitude and fraternal attitude towards those people who are interested and admire, and like why it was so important to break off and start the guild and share this material that Kevin had been working on, right? Translating this stuff, getting it out to as many people, and then forming sort of bonds of fraternity with as many people as wanted to, and organizing get-togethers and just like, he believed that, right? So like, whereas lots of people felt strongly about the way things were going in that organization, and felt like that maybe it was the best for the community, right? We're building a community or whatever, to figure out a different way of doing it. Like for Mike, it was about anarchism and getting this out to everybody, and building bonds of fraternity, right? And like, and I feel like he was one of the only people in the world that could have done that. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, reflecting on what you're saying, you haven't told me shit about how he fenced or how good he was. And I think...
Well, okay, so I will tell you, I won't tell you about, I have no interest in how good he was. But, right, but I can tell you about how he fenced, and that would be a fun conversation. But go ahead. It certainly wasn't the primary way that I was go ahead.
Yeah, but I find that interesting, because it's very clear to me that you speak of him as that mentor, right? Mm-hmm. That we've been saying HEMA needs mentors, or we need a path towards mentorship. And I had thrown out the thesis that mentors are made by those who want them to be. Mm-hmm. Mm. And it seems to me, from the way you speak of Mike, that he would have maybe recoiled at the idea.
Oh yeah, no, he wouldn't. Yeah, he was the worst. He would have been absolutely appalled.
He would have fucking hated it, right? And yet, clearly, for you and for probably many, many others in your community, he was the guy. He was the mentor. So I think that's a beautiful example of what we've been talking about.
Right. I think so. I do want to talk a little bit, because now that you brought up how he fenced, I think that there's something there to talk about. He fenced he fenced with energy.
Nice.
He fenced with energy. He had a real passion in his fencing, that every single engagement was an opportunity to embody this sort of it's so hard to describe. It's like metaphysical, right?
Yeah.
This sort of like, so we'll have to share. There are some videos. There are some videos of Mike. I don't think he fenced in that first tournament that they held in Florida. I think there's actually a video of him and Jake going for it. And that's nice. Really, I would say, going for it, right? Like that's the way I would describe Mike's fencing, is that he went for it. He left it all on the table every single time. Yeah. And he certainly did the plays. He went through the body mechanics. He tried to learn Meyer as best he could, and it came through in his fencing for sure. But there was also this sort of what he brought was a sort of emotional strength, right? That's what he learned. That's what he learned from the texts was this emotional strength, this confidence, and energy. And it's just like, I mean, it's impossible to describe, but it was beautiful. It was beautiful, and it was exhilarating. I mean, it is exhilarating. Like when you watch, it's exhilarating. So I'm excited that folks are going to get a chance. We'll link it in the description.
Yeah.
But you know, I don't even care. I couldn't care less about how he did. Right. Like, I don't know what his exchanges look like. Right. Like, I just know that it's breathtaking to watch.
Right.
Right. And
inspirational. I mean, it sounds to me like the guy was an inspiration.
He really was. And part of it was just the fact that he recoiled at the idea that he was inspirational. And part of it was that he was the only person in the world that could have founded, a guild. Like the reason that the fact that they chose guild, right? The fact that they chose the guild was a reflection of his anarchism, right? There were no masters. The only master was Meyer, and that the guild was built around a love of Meyer, and So I'm touched, and I'm missing my comrades over there in Iowa who they're all gone from Iowa now, but this past weekend they were in Iowa, and I look forward to getting a chance to see those guys again. But they lifted a glass to the guild captain, the Oberhauptmann, Mike, anarchist Mike, yesterday or 2 days ago, and I lifted my my proverbial glass, and now I'm going to go to Baltimore and see my friends over there. So I'll be able to. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just sorry. It was so rambly today. Sorry, it was so rambly today, people.
I mean, again, it's what everybody comes for.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think in the next couple of weeks, so I'm going to be in Baltimore. I think I might be driving back on Monday, so we'll have to figure out when we're going to schedule the next one, but we'll probably have some guests on in the next several weeks. So look forward to that.
That's the plan. That's the plan.
And all right. It was good to see you. We'll see you.
It was good to see you too.
We'll talk soon.
All right.